The question about Lecha Dodi, and the custom that was referred to in the question is really a Syrian custom. It's not a general Sephardic custom. And Lecha Dodi spells out the acrostic Shlomo Halevi, and this minhag leaves out the Halevi, the Hey Lamed Vav Yud, and that's all about Mashiach. So that's good stuff. That's not mourning on Shabbos. That's Geula. Why would they leave it out? And the explanation that was given was that this dates from the time of Shabtai Tzvi, that when Shabtai Tzvi was the false Mashiach and he was discredited, there was a movement in some kehilos not to talk about Mashiach that much in davening, because people might get excited and think that Shabtai Tzvi was Mashiach. So the messianic stanzas were eliminated because of Shabtai Tzvi. That is reason number one. Reason number two, apparently, that the Syrians had a minhag that they liked to shorten piyutim, and therefore they figured as long as they get in Shlomo, they didn't have to get in Halevi, because they felt that long piyutim are tircha de tzibura. Now, in truth, among Ashkenazim, we have the same thing. Not in Lecha Dodi, we do say Lecha Dodi, but if you look in the davening of Yomim Noraim, where we say a lot of piyutim, you wouldn't know it, but in point of fact, a lot of what we say are just the first line and the last line. And the original piyut was much, much longer. So there was a concept of tircha de tzibura, and it was suggested that that was the Syrian minhag of Lecha Dodi. So that was point number one. I wanted to be mosif. Point number two, we were asked last week about going into a church, and I had mentioned that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, did go to Westminster Abbey for the wedding of whatever the name is, William and Kate Middleton, right? So I went to that wedding, and there was a whole big controversy, how you're allowed to go into a church, and he claimed it based on the Gemara that since he was Karov Lamalchus, since he was an intercessor on behalf of the Jewish people, and he was relating to the monarchy, he needed to do this. And I just raised the question that some say that that only applies in the olden days, where if you didn't listen to the king, he would cut off your head or be geyser on all the Jewish people, destruction. It really doesn't apply that much to a constitutional monarchy. Okay, so that was Jonathan Sachs. So I mentioned in passing, that I believed that his predecessor, Rabbi Jakobowitz, again, Zichrono Livracha, might have done the same thing. I just said it derech agav, but I got a letter from someone who knows Rabbi Jacobowitz's grandson, and he spoke to the grandson, so they check up on you here, and the grandson said as far as he knew, Rabbi Jacobowitz never went into a church. Now that doesn't mean he knew it for sure anyway, but I didn't want to say anything that might be construed as perhaps Motzi Shemra on Rabbi Jacobowitz. So that was the second point. Third point. We were asked about Pesach, right? Dor Yesharim. Dor Yesharim does genetic testing, and it started because of Pesach, and the concept would be that Pesach is an Ashkenaz is a genetic illness, primarily among Ashkenazic Jews. But in order to transmit the illness to a child, both parents have to be carriers, and if both parents are carriers of the gene, there is a 1 in 4 chance that a child will have the disease. If only one parent is a carrier, there is 0 chance. The disease will not be transmitted with one carrier. Now, Tay-Sachs is an awful disease. It has a lot of pain and suffering, and the children progressively lose all sorts of functions, vision, and the like, eventually paralysis, and they die young, and there's no cure for it so far. So Dor Yesharim created, back in the 1980s, a screening program that when people were dating, they would have genetic testing, and if both of them were carriers, they would be given the notification that this is not compatible. If only one was a carrier, they wouldn't say which one is a carrier, they would just say, this shidduch is compatible. Now, Lamaisa, today, it's very easy to find out, but you can do this yourself. I mean, Dor Yesharim started at a time when genetic testing was not as available as it is today. Today, everybody can do it on their own, but this is Dor Yesharim. Now, Dor Yesharim started off with Tay-Sachs, but then it expands to all sorts of other conditions, some of which are not necessarily as serious. So if you look at the Dor Yesharim website, you will see that they have haskamos from many, 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 many gedolim, including a letter written by Rav Moshe Feinstein, or allegedly written by Moshe Feinstein, that was signed in Tufshin Mem Hey, which is 1985, which is approximately a year and a half before his death. Now, I remembered even before that I'd always remembered that Rav Moshe Feinstein was maskim, that Dor Yesharim is a reasonable hishtadlus, and one is allowed to check genetic conditions whether a shidduch would be proper or not. So somebody raised a question that they had heard that Rav Reuven Feinstein said that Rav Moshe was against Dor Yesharim, he was against the Tay-Sachs testing and the like, and I had said, I remembered Rav Moshe gave a haskama, and I looked up online and I saw the haskama itself, so I thought that was the end of the matter. Rav Moshe said, gave a haskama, that's it. Apparently, Rav Reuven Feinstein took the position that that was a forged signature, and Rav Moshe never gave the haskama. Now, once we get into that type of he said type of thing, I don't know what to say. I mean, all I can tell you is that I had heard even in yeshiva, which was before this, many years before this, that Rav Moshe in principle was maskim, and indeed there are tshuvos. There are tshuvos in the Igros Moshe, not about Dor Yesharim per se, but about the idea of not getting married to someone in which there's a high incidence of a genetic illness. But again, so I know that what I'm telling you now is not helping you, it's confusing you. But I just have to tell you the emes that apparently there is a machlokes out there, what Rav Moshe actually said. So I went back to actually look at the physical letter. Now the physical letter is typed. The signature is not Rav Moshe's signature. That much I could say. In other words, I looked at the signature. It is not Rav Moshe's signature. But it is also the case that towards the end of Rav Moshe's life, he would often dictate letters and didn't always sign them because it was physically hard for him to sign. So the fact that it's not Rav Moshe's signature, it's not a proof that it's a forgery. First of all, if you're trying to forge a signature, you try to make it look like the signature. This looks totally different. So whoever was trying to forge it did a pretty bad job, because it's obvious it's not Rav Moshe's signature. So I just want to point out the fact that it's not Rav Moshe's signature is not a proof that it's a forgery. On the other hand, it's also not a proof that it's authentic. So I don't know what to say. But the truth of the matter is, there are many, many other gedolim who did give a haskama as well, and there is no allegation of forgery. So I think Tay-Sachs is very much, Dor Yesharim is very much makubal in the frum community, but some of the extensions may not be, meaning when you're dealing with fatal, painful illnesses that don't have a refuah, I think we could be somech on Gedolei Yisrael that said genetic testing is proper. When you're dealing with someone that may have an obesity gene or whatever it would be, maybe you don't ask so many questions, meaning you don't try to have a perfect child, because the Eibishter has all sorts of ways in which our plans are frustrated. So again, I know this answer is a little confusing, but at least I want you to be aware of it. Yeah?
Is there any zechus of the Russian Prime Minister saying...
Well, I'm not taking questions yet. I'm finishing my Hosafos of last week, and I'll be almost finished, and I'll take a question. Okay. The next issue was we spoke briefly about the famous closing of the Volozhiner Yeshiva in the 1890s, and the fact that this is because the yeshiva world says, because the Russian government demanded the inclusion of secular studies, and the Netziv concluded it is better to not have a yeshiva than have a yeshiva with secular studies, and this is the Messiah in the Olam HaYeshivos, why the greatest yeshiva in the world was closed down, because of the Tuma of secular studies. Now, I had mentioned that Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan's son, the Netziv's nephew, the secretary of the Netziv, a Talmud of Volozhin, the author of Torah Tamima, writes a very different account of this in his wonderful biography, the Makor Baruch, in which he says the Netziv was not against secular studies. The Netziv was against the demand of the Russian government that they only learn from 9 to 1. They have secular studies from 3 to 7, and the yeshiva has to be closed at night. So the Netziv said, at that point, let them learn in the base medrash. In other words, the Netziv was not against, Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein says, was not against 1 or 2 hours of limudei chol in the yeshiva. He was against kind of being mavatel afternoon and night seder in the yeshiva. That, he said already, was not kedai. Now, I knew, and I didn't mention, that the Netziv's oldest son, Rav Chaim Berlin, actually was made that his father on his deathbed said he was totally against secular studies. That's what Rav Chaim Berlin said. The younger son of the Netziv, who was a little bit more modern, Rav Meir Berlin, later known as Rav Meir Bar Ilan, that's the Netziv's son, Bar Ilan Street, Bar Ilan University, and he was a Talmud Chacham. I know sometimes in the yeshiva world he's portrayed like some type of raving apikoros. I mean, he was a Talmud Chacham and a frum person, obviously. He was a Zionist. He happened to be a Zionist. That happened to be it. He was made exactly like Baruch Halevi Epstein. So you have a machlokas among the Netziv's own children. But somebody pointed out to me an interesting fact. He said, the fact that the Netziv expressed agreement to some level of secular studies does not mean he really believed it. In fact, he pointed out to a whole history. The Russian government was always making demands. And the Netziv was always saying, sure, we'll do it. But he never had intention to do it. And there was a whole history of the Netziv making promises to the Russian government and then not carrying out because he felt it was injurious to the cause of Torah. So that's an interesting hora, meaning, in a sense, Elo v'elo divrei Elokim chayim, meaning, yeah, the Netziv said he supported a certain amount of limudei chol. Right? That could be true. But that doesn't mean he actually believed it. He said it because he thought it might get the Russian government off his back until the demand was so excessive. Right? So that's an interesting ha'ara, which you might be mitzaref to the two opinions. The final issue, then I'll hold it open to questions, is instant coffee. And I had, on Shabbos, making instant coffee on Shabbos. So I had mentioned that Halacha, we can make instant coffee in a kli sheni, meaning to say you fill up the hot water into a cup and you can stir the instant coffee into the cup. It is important to point out that was the tradition, was and is the traditional psak halacha lemaisa. But unfortunately, to make things a little more complicated, it depends on certain new types of brands of coffee that are on the market. Because traditionally, the way instant coffee was made, the beans were roasted, they were ground, and then they were brewed. They were actually cooked in water, and as a result, under the principle that there's no cooking after cooking, you can put them directly, at least in a kli sheni. However, some of the newer brands, like Nescafe Gold, and I have to get a list of the exact brands, I'll try to circulate it, actually have most of the coffee is brewed, but they have a small percentage of coffee that is only roasted and not brewed. Now, roasting is like afia. It's cooking with dry heat. And even though we paskin ein bishel achar bishel, but we do paskin yesh bishel achar afia utzliya, so it turns out you would not be allowed to make that coffee. Well, Sephardim would be allowed to. Sephardim actually paskin ein bishel achar. So Sephardim can go with kli sheni, no problem at all. Ashkenazim would have a problem for those coffee mixes in a kli sheni. Lanias daiti, I think you could make them in a kli shlishi, although some people are machmer even in that. So I would recommend, if you're not sure about your instant coffee, pour it one more over, meaning to say the urn is rishon, the first cup is sheni, pour it in another cup is a shlishi, and then you could be somech cooking in a kli shlishi in such a situation. Sephardim can continue to make all instant coffee in a kli sheni, and the truth is, Rabbi Ovadia says they could even pour from the urn itself onto the coffee because they hold ein bishel achar tzliya. Okay, so those were my 5 corrections for today. You had a question, yeah?
Yeah, is there any zechus? I know the Ukrainian Prime Minister is Jewish. I know he's staying behind and risking his life for his country.
Yeah.
He's not sitting in a basement Jewish, or maybe even not even married to a Jew. I don't know. But is there any zechus in him staying behind and protecting his people?
Yeah, the question is an interesting question. What is his name? Zelensky? Zelensky is a Jewish guy. It's interesting. Life imitates art, as the saying goes. He was a comedian who was playing a president. So Memele, when he decides to run for president, they figure, hey, he was a good president in those 10 TV shows, so let's make him president. So Lamaisa, initially one might not have taken him very seriously, but with a lot of credit to him, He's a person of great courage, and he's standing up for his people. He's trying to protect his people. And the fact that the Ukrainians elected a Jew as president, even a non-religious Jew, is pretty much of a miracle, because the Ukrainians were notorious anti-Semites during World War II. So perhaps all of this could even be seen as a little bit of a progression towards the Messianic era, when the Umos Ha'olam are going to turn to Klal Yisrael. We see this, by the way, with the Arab countries, the Emirates and Dubai and all of that. And now I think there are 2 Chabad houses there, and a number of kosher restaurants, and I believe every treif restaurant in Dubai has to offer a kosher option, whatever it would be. So all of this is part of the mahalech of Teshuva that will come b'achris hayamim. So the question that you asked is, Zelensky isn't learning, doesn't put on tefillin every day. Does he have a zechus in Shemayim because he's protecting his people? I'll tell you my problem. I mean, theoretically that would be so. The only question is, are the Jews worse off being in Russia or versus Ukraine? Like almost lamay nafkamina, meaning what is the cause that we're fighting for? If Putin would have been, let's say, Hitler, yeah, for sure, a great zechus to get rid of somebody or to fight somebody who is going to destroy you. But the truth of the matter is, Putin, with all of his faults, and again, Putin is a Marusha, Putin happens to be pretty good to the Jewish people in Russia. The Jewish people in Russia, the community in Russia, happen to like him for whatever reason. And again, it's not l'shma and it's not l'shem shamayim, whatever it is. So here's my problem. Zelensky is fighting for a cause. But is the cause really that important? What's going to happen? What would happen if Russia would conquer the Ukraine, right? So that's my problem. The problem basically is, if somebody is meiser nefesh for something that at the end of the day isn't really that important, so does Hashem say, oh, you're meiser nefesh? Or does Hashem say, for what? So that's my problem. I mean, the idea of national independence, we're so used to that as being such a chashuv a thing. Maybe it's not so chashuv. Now again, as I say, if we would be fighting Hitler, if we would be fighting Stalin, if we would be fighting somebody who would not allow Yidden to keep Torah and mitzvahs, that would become a noble cause. I'm not sure if Ukrainian independence is b'etzem such a noble cause. So that's my hesitation about it. So I don't know. Yeah.
When it talks about in the Gemara, when the rabbis are learning Torah, what exactly does that mean, and like what will they learn?
I'm sorry, when it talks about who learning Torah?
The Rabbi in the Gemara, the Amar.
When the Amoram were learning Torah? Yeah, so that's not so much of a problem. I mean, first of all, by the time you get to the Amoraim, we had a Mishnah. We had a book called the Mishnah. So what did the Amoraim do? The Amoraim would learn the Mishnah, and then they would discuss it. I mean, the same way we learn Gemara and we discuss it, they learned the Mishnah, and the Gemara is essentially a transcript of dialogues and discussions that took place over hundreds of years in many, many different places. Again, I spoke in my share in the afternoon about how Ravina and Rav Ashi had to compile hundreds and hundreds of years. I think of this as like a messy office in which they had piles and piles of notebooks from here and there, and they had people who gave testimony as to what was discussed, and Ravina and Rav Ashi had to figure out, what part of the discussion they should put in, when was it repetitive, etc. Right? So in terms of what the Amoraim learned, basically they learned Mishnah, and they analyzed the Mishnah to try to come to a halacha l'maisa. Now, when you ask me, what did they learn in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, which is before Matan Torah, that's a difficult question, because there was no text, there was no sefer, and there wasn't even halacha that much, because before Matan Torah, we didn't have all of these mitzvahs, and B'nai Noach are not mitzvah anyway. So I think I suggested in an earlier Q&A that, number one, the halachic part of the curriculum were the Zion mitzvahs b'nei Noach, which have many ramifications. But I think largely the yeshiva of Shem and Aver was a spiritual place. I think they learned meditation, they learned nevuah, they learned Kabbalah, they learned how to connect themselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a physical world. So I think it would have looked very different than a yeshiva today. It wasn't a yeshiva focused on svarim, and it wasn't, certainly, there weren't svarim. It was not a yeshiva focused on halacha. There wasn't a lot of halacha. It was a yeshiva that was focused directly on avodas Hashem, how to recognize God in the world, how to connect to God. And I would imagine that what we would later call Kabbalah would have been a big component of that.
Why are there exactly 70 nations?
Why are there 70? Well, the 70. Well, it depends on what you mean by why. How we know there are 70 is simply counting the various nations that come out of Parshas Noach, etc. Why we have 70 nations? So it's really connected to a combination of two ideas. Number one, HaKadosh Baruch Hu manifests himself in the world through the 10 spheros. There are 10 emanations. And the manifestation in time is across 7 days of the week, which is the cycle of time that then repeats itself. So Memela, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's revelation within the world will be in the context of the 10 spheros times the 70 nations. Now, the Vilna Gaon says a very interesting thing. The Vilna Gaon says that 35 of the nations come from Yishmael, and 35 of the nations come from Esav, and he's masber a lot of things with that. So it's important to understand the comment of the Vilna Gaon. What does the Vilna Gaon mean when he says 35 nations come from Esav and 35 nations come from Yishmael? In truth, none of the nations come from Esav and none of the nations come from Yishmael. Remember, the 70 nations are not counting Avram, right? Zera Avram. And Yishmael comes from Avraham and Esav comes from Yitzchak. Right? So none of the nations come from Yishmael. That's a separate cheshbon. Yishmael and Esav are not part of the 70 nations. So what the Vilna Gaon means on a deeper level is not that these 70 nations are descended from Yishmael and Esav. They in fact are not, other than through intermarriage and the like, but rather the spiritual koach of 35 nations is getting it from Yishmael, the negative spiritual koach, and 35 nations are getting their spiritual negative koach from Esav. What is the difference between the spiritual koach of Yishmael and the spiritual koach of Esav? So there are different ways of being mocked. In other words, they represent negative forces that are kind of blocking godliness in the world. Right? Hashem has the 10 spheros over the 7 days, but these are the blockages, and Hashem is Kaviyachal. History is designed to break through those blockages, to create a revelation. So one explanation might be that Esav represents the challenge of Western civilization, which we might call hedonistic, atheistic materialism, in which the goal of life is to banish God and to simply glorify the material, glorify hedonism, glorify taiva. That represents the kayach of Esav. What does Esav say when Esav is starving for the beans and Yaakov wants to buy the bechira, which is the right to do the avoda? Esav says, Hine anechi haylech lamos. Behold, I'm going to die. V'lama zeli bechira. Who needs the bechira? Chazal say he's not just saying, I'm hungry, I'm going to die, I'm hungry. He's making a statement. After this physical existence, there's no life after death. There is no spiritual dimension. There is no ruchnius. There is only the taiva of this world. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. And Memela, who needs bechira? What's bechira to me? Avodah of Hashem? What do I need avodah of Hashem? So Esav represents the challenge of Western civilization, which even when it's benign, even when it's not violent, let's say the United States, it's geared towards a hedonism, a consumerism, taiva. Yishmael represents the opposite. Right? So Esav represents the denial of God. Yishmael represents the desecration of God by invoking Hashem for immoral, destructive purposes. The Bnei Yishmael very much believe in God. They daven 5 times a day. They're makbid on snius. Right? Women have to dress in a proper way. In fact, I remember reading that Jordan did not want Israeli teenagers to come into their country because they felt Israeli teenagers were dragging down the modesty of the community. I mean, that's kind of pretty much of a chilul Hashem. We don't want the Jews. They're not tznius enough in their dress and in their behavior. So, Yishmael are ma'aminim. Yishmael believe in Hashem. Right? Islam is not idolatry. The Rambam paskins, although the Rambam hated Islam and the Rambam suffered tremendously under Islamic persecution. But he said the one credit they have is they have Avodah Zarah, unlike Christianity, where the Rambam said they were. But what does Islam do? But Islam takes their... I don't want to get an email about I'm besmirching Islam. Okay, let's not say Islam. Let's talk about Muslim fundamentalists. Okay, to be more exact in my language. They take the name of God and they use it to justify violence and hatred and destruction. So it turns out with the Vilna Gaon is Merames that 35 nations are going to challenge us with hedonistic materialism. And 35 nations are going to challenge us with a religious fanaticism that is predicated on hatred. And the Gra is suggesting these will be the two challenges that Am Yisrael is going to face b'acharis hayamim. And these are not just challenges from outside of us. These are challenges from within us. Meaning, within us we face the nisayon of laziness and rejection of Hashem, but we also face the nisayon of kind of a religious fanaticism that finds its expression in sinas chinam, right? So there's a lot of deep ideas that there's an Esav within us, and there's a Yishmael within us, and we can only defeat the Esavs and Yishmaels outside of us when we defeat the Esav and Yishmael within us. So the point I'm making is, just in terms of pshat, do not interpret the Gra to mean that 35 nations come from Esav and 35 nations come from Yishmael. In fact, the 70 nations are not from Esav or Yishmael at all, but it means from where are they getting their spiritual identity and their koach. Okay? Yeah.
I think it was Elijah who said that like when Mashiach is coming, there's a certain tefilla will be very important.
The what? The
Tefilla.
yes.
So why is there not more of a focus on tefilla Mashiach?
Yeah, so the question is, as we approach Mashiach, but even before Mashiach, I mean, tefillah has a great, great importance. Why do we not focus on tefillah in yeshiva? The Gemara itself points out, already in the time of the tannaim and amoraim, it says, tefillah is a davar ha'omed barumo shel olam. Tefillah is something that stands at the height, the highest thing in the world. Uvnei adam mizalzalin ba. This is the Gemara. And people treat it as nothing. They treat it as a mabakach. They treat it as something, I have to do it, but I just want to get it over with and go on to something else. So the question you're raising is not a new question. It's been around quite a long time. And I guess we could ask, we could ask all of ourselves. You're asking why doesn't the yeshiva emphasize it? Well, first of all, let me point out that yeshivas are a lot better than not in yeshiva. If you're asking me why yeshivas don't emphasize tefillah, okay, you're right. But outside of yeshiva, the tefillahs are even faster, usually, and it's even worse, right? So yeshiva is already an improvement over non-yeshiva. That's why I remember of Weinbach, Zechreinu Livracha, Baruch Hashem, we live in a city where, you can get a minyan anytime you want. In fact, I remember once, years ago, it's funny, but a little sad as well. For some reason, I had an emergency, and I was not able, this was Shabbos, I had to leave after Shacharis before Kriyas HaTorah. And I wasn't able to hear Kriyas HaTorah until 2 o'clock. So I figured, okay, I went to a certain place that has minyanim all the time. I figured, I'll come in at 2 o'clock, I'll probably get a Kriyas HaTorah. When I came in at 2 o'clock, the minyan didn't start Birchas HaShachar yet. So I had to wait a long time to hear Kriyas HaTorah. So Baruch Hashem, we live in a place where there's so many minyanim, But Rav Weinbach Zatzal always made the point that he was very makbid that Talmidim of the yeshiva should daven in the yeshiva. And there were a few reasons for this. One reason is that indeed the Gemara itself says there's an inyan to daven in the place where you learn. The Gemara itself says you want to connect your Torah and tefillah. But number two, he said that minyanim outside of yeshiva might sometimes be very, very fast, etc., and it's important to have a slow minyan. I remember myself, forgive me for digressing, that the first time I visited Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, which eventually became my own yeshiva, I think I was in 6th or 7th grade, and people arranged class trips that would take us to see yeshivas. And I was so amazed when I walked into the Beis Medrash and I heard Yehei Shmei Rabbah for the first time so loud. I mean, after a while you get used to it. It doesn't move me that much anymore. But the first time compared to the Young Israel or compared to other synagogues, it was so amazing. So yeshiva, Baruch Hashem, is a lot better than non-yeshiva, but it's still very, very true that all of us, I include myself, we have a lot of difficulty connecting to tefillah. We don't appreciate its value. I mean, part of it is because we're saying the same thing, not just one every day, but 3 times a day, a Shemona Esrei. Part of it is, I'll give you another thing too. Part of it is psychologically. Part of what excites us in learning is learning can be an expression of egotism, ingenuity, and creativity. When I'm learning, I'm smart. I get to assert myself. I get to put in my point and my idea. And that egotism, although it's not the highest madrega, but that could be a certain, shalol lishma that helps a person. I want to learn because I want to, understand something. I want to master it, etc. With tefillah, it's exactly the opposite. The essence of tefillah is to be mevatel your ego and to understand that without God, you're nothing at all. And it's very, very hard for us to be mevatel our ego and our gaiva and to feel that without Hashem, we're nothing. That's kind of, you see, the motivator of learning is actually the opposite of what you need for tefillah. So so what do we do about this? I mean, the Kuzari writes, ideally, that just as a normal person eats 3 meals a day to give nutrition to their body, we have 3 tefillahs a day because this is the nutrition of the soul. This is soul food. And the Kuzari writes that the zmanim of tefillah should be the most pleasurable part of the day. I mean, again, I don't want to speak for anybody, but most of us don't look towards it that way. That, wow, Baruch Hashem, now is mincha, now is mariv, now is shachris. It's like, your ice cream break or whatever it will be. He says there should be a pleasure, there should be a geschmack that I'm able to talk to the Borei Olam and he listens to me and he wants to connect to me. And he says that should be literally, he describes it as the height of the day, the most exciting part of the day. How do we feel? Just to give you an example, and again, I include myself, I'm not being self-righteous here. When it's a Monday and a Thursday, and you have to say the long tachanun for Hu Rachum, but all of a sudden there's a chassan there, or a yahrzeit there, or something. Okay, I don't want to judge anybody, but I think many of us have a little bit of a sigh of relief. When in reality, I don't have a chance to be misabel over the Chorban and pour out my prayers to Hashem that we should have a Yeshua, we should have a Geula. Yeah, Baruch Hashem, there's a bris, that's great, but I miss the opportunity to plead and beg Hashem. Right? So I remember hearing at the Levaya of an old woman who was a very righteous woman. So one of her grandchildren gave a hesped. So he said, it was kind of cute, he said that the one thing his bubby never understood, that when she would offer to make a meal for somebody, they would say, I don't want to wash. Because why? I don't want to wash because I don't want to bench. He says, she didn't understand, why would a person ever have the attitude they don't want to bench? Why not? Why don't you want to bench, right? So what you're saying is 100% right. And the answer is we just have to understand what an opportunity it is to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and how much he wants us to talk to him and what an opportunity. So why don't we do more of it in yeshiva? Well, I mean, as I say, yeshiva is actually better than non-yeshiva. We do more, we talk more about it here than you might do it elsewhere. But like everything else, you could say, why don't we learn Chumash more? Why don't we learn Halacha more? Okay, the truth is a lot of things we don't do, but you got to take the achrayus, because tefillah is such a yesod. And the Chazon Ish writes that to be marich, he's not the first one, to be marich in tefillah, to say I don't want to be marich in tefillah because of bittul Torah is a big mistake, because in reality the siyata d'shmaya you get from Hashem as a result of your tefillah will give you hatzlacha in your learning. So you'll actually come out ahead. That's now the Vilna Gaon does say that one should not spend more than 3 hours a day in tefillah. So he does give a 3-hour limit. Okay, but Baruch Hashem, I think even with the yeshiva shapes, Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv is not 3 hours. So we're well within the limit, and we could even make Shachris an hour and a half, and it wouldn't we wouldn't offend the Vilna Gaon's list. Now, in reality, though, I have a little bit of a kasha on the Gra. Obviously, the Gra knew this, and he could answer this very easily. But that is, remember the Mishnah in Brachos that talks about Chasidim Harishainim, the early pious people. They would prepare for davening for an hour, then they would daven for an hour, and then they would meditate on their davening after an hour. So they spent 9 hours a day on davening, not 3 hours. They spent 9 hours. And the Gemara Taka asks on that, how could they spend 9 hours on their davening? Tairasan, Emasai, when did they learn? And the answer is, the Gemara's answer exactly is this, that because they served Hashem with all of their heart, then the time that they learned, they were tremendously, tremendously successful. By the way, just as an aside, although this is not your question, the Stipler said the same thing is true with chesed. An avrech, a guy that got married, went to the Stipler and complained a little bit. My wife is always asking me to do things, go shopping, whatever it is. He felt that it was taking him away from his learning, and it's not good. So the Stipler said, you will never lose out with the chesed that you do for someone else, because when you do chesed, you're emulating the midah of Hashem. And by emulating the midah of Hashem, you're closer to Hashem. When you're closer to Hashem, your ability to absorb Torah is going to be much greater. So you'll be able to accomplish in 3 hours what would have taken you 6 hours. So memela, the 3 hours of helping your wife is not going to take away from your learning. You will just accomplish more of it in less time. So he said the same thing is true with chesed. And I've said this before. One of my favorite stories is a story involving Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, Zechreinu Livracha, where another guy went over to him, an avrech who got married, and he said that his wife asks him to take out the garbage when he goes to shul in the morning, and he feels that since he's a ben Torah and a Talmid Chacham, and he learns, it's not covered. He says he would like to help his wife. He said, I'd like to, but it's not covered for a man like me to take out the garbage. That's not what a Talmid Chacham does. So Chaim Shmulevitz says to him, yeah, you're right, a man like you shouldn't be doing these things. Totally wrong. So the next morning, 6:30 in the morning, there's a knock at the door, and he opens the door, and he sees Rav Chaim there. And he says, Rosh Hashiva, like, what's here? He says, I know that your wife wants you to take out the garbage, and it's not covered for you, so I said I would come and take it out for you. He said, so the guy got the point at that point. Yeah.
Where did the minhag of eating parsely as karpas come from, and is it correct?
Well, okay, karpas which is the idea of eating a vegetable before the main meal. It's interesting. The actual origin of it is very undramatic, but over the course of years, different, deeper symbols were given. As far as the Mishnah and Gemara is concerned, the Chachamim simply wanted to make the meal an unusual meal, that instead of first washing and eating bread and then having courses, we have an extra vegetable course before the meal, kedei sheyishalu hatinaikas, so that the children will ask, why are you doing this unusual thing? So it was an expression of luxury, like an extra hors d'oeuvre, something like that. And we would tell the child, this is because we're celebrating like kings. So the only requirement of the Gemara is that it be a vegetable, Barei Pri Adama, so it doesn't make a difference what vegetable it is. It could be anything. It could be, well, if you're Sephardi, it could be corn, if it's before Kitnius, or whatever, potato, and the like. Now later, this is not from the Gemara, so the Gemara doesn't give you any fancy mystical reasons. Later, they looked at the word karpas and they connected it to samach, perech, 600,000 people of backbreaking labor. They connected it to spring, which is renewal, chodesh ha'aviv, and the like. Now, I want to point out that in Poland, in fact, those of you that have parents or grandparents that came from Poland or Russia, you may know that the standard karpas was potato. And that's because Pesach was kind of the very beginning, it was still winter in winter climate, and they didn't have green stuff at all. They only had potatoes or maybe radishes, root, things that grow underground. But the idea of karpas was simply later, when green vegetables became accessible, it was thought that green is a symbol of renewal, his chachos. Pesach is called chodesh ha'aviv. That's why we have a leap year, because when Pesach gets too early, it's in the winter, we have to have it in the spring. So it was thought that the best remez of karpas would be connected to something green. Now, why parsley instead of something else green? That I don't know. Did you see a reason yourself? I'll check into it. But
we were going over a Gemara and Pesachim, and we were talking about, I guess karpas came up, or parsley came up, and it was like, the bracha on it is chol generally, because it's a garnish. So
yes.
That's why we were like, do you say adama on, is that appropriate?
So the halacha is, if you use it for karpas, you make adama because you're taking it in its capacity as a vegetable. But why parsley? I'll try to check. Now, parsley has other shilas, because parsley needs to be checked very carefully. Parsley can be infested with bugs. That's a separate shaila. But as far as I know, the issue was green. And again, Medina de Gemara, there is no requirement of green vegetable anyway. But that was a supplementary remez to connecting it to Chodesh Aviv. But I'll check into it. And again, as I say, if your parents or grandparents are from Poland or Russia, they would use potato. One other thing to remember about karpas, maybe we'll talk more about it, I don't want to go over the laws of the Seder yet, and that is, when you eat karpas, you should eat less than the shiur of a bracha acharona, less than a kazayas, which might be hard sometimes because you're hungry at that part. You haven't eaten for a while. And the reason is because if you eat a shir kazayas, since it's before hamotzi, you may have to make a bracha acharona. And what's wrong with that? You'll then have a shaila, what do I do about the moror? Okay, let me explain this. After hamotzi and matzah, we eat moror. Now on moror, we make a bracha al achilas moror. Why don't I make a bracha Barei Pri Adama on the moror? The answer is it's a suffix bracha, because do I treat the moror as part of the meal, in which it's covered by the hamotzi, or do I treat it as not part of the meal, in which case it's not covered by the hamotzi? That's a machlokas. Now, therefore, the eitzah to get out of this machlokas is when you make the hadama on the karpas, have kavana to cover the moror, and then mimanafshach, you don't have to make a bracha. But if I ate a shiur kazayas, I would have to make a bracha acharayna. Now, if I make a bracha acharayna, I will then have a suffix. Do I make ha'adama on the moror or not? Now, l'maisa, if it's a suffix, you don't make a bracha. Suffix bracha is l'hakel, but it's better not to put yourself in a suffix bracha, and that is why you bedafke eat less than a kazayas. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. Yeah.
First of all, a lot of times the Rav references.
The what? The
Rabbi references kabbalistic terms
Yeah.
when answering questions.
Yeah.
Is there a preference to using Kabbalah, or if someone feels more connected to the more rationalistic tannaim and bachurim? Is there a preference for where one should draw from? And also, in a slightly connected note, what is the traditional approach of the Litvish world towards gedolim having mystical abilities and powers? Is that something that we see as a representation of godless in some way?
Yeah.
Having some value, we have a responsibility to believe in those things.
Yeah, so the issue, first of all, about the more rationalist approaches versus Kabbalah, I mean, obviously there were different Messiahs in Klal Yisrael, and I'm not going to tell a person that, you must force yourself into a Kabbalistic mindset if that is not your netiyah. If you want to follow the Rambam, if you want to follow Mahalchim like that, that's certainly fine. I mean, the Iker is the Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah and Torah and Mitzvahs, and how you connect how you create your connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu will then be a function of looking at those sources and then making your connection. It happens to be, though, that Kabbalah and Hasidus, because Hasidus is essentially almost a popularization of Kabbalah in many ways, happens to be for many, many people a way that appeals to them. You could give interesting psychological reasons why that's so. So as a result, I think you see, it's not just me, I think you see in the Yeshivish world, the Litvish Yeshivish world over the past 50 years, much more of an emphasis, or at least incorporation, of Kabbalah and Hasidic ideas. Rev Dessler was very influential in that, by the way, as was Rev Hutner, and they kind of brought it in, and indeed, when Rev Dessler brought it into Panovich, there were some of the old Balei Musar who did not like that. Rav Chaskel Evenstein did not like Rav Dessler's Mahalach at all. He thought it was not the Messiah, but Rav Dessler felt it was a tzarich of the Dor, and many people feel that way as well. And keep in mind as well that there were many non-Hasidic gedolim who were great mekubalim. The Gra was 100%. In fact, the ksavim we have from the Gra are much more numerous on Kabbalah than Halacha. On the Zayar, Tikkunei Zayar, the Safra Tznias, all sorts of things. If you look at the Gra's Perish on Mishlei, although there's a lot of Musar in the Perish, but there's a tremendous amount of Kabbalah in the Perish of Gra on Mishlei, which is one of the reasons why it's never been translated. It's kind of amazing that the Gra's Perish on Mishlei, there's not a single English translation of it at all. Part of it is because it's very heavily Kabbalah. The Ramchal, these were not Hasidim at all. And of course, Sfardim and Bechlal have a separate Messiah of Kabbalah. Now, in terms of mofsim, of miracles, so it's a tricky thing. Even in the Litvisha world, we believe that there were Kama gedolim who did miracles. So there are stories about the Gra, etc. Even Bizman Hazeh, with Reb Chaim Kanevsky, people tell different stories. But the Brisker Rav never liked those stories. The Brisker Rav actually said that should not be the measure of a person. The measure of a gadol should be his Torah, his Yiras Shamayim, his Midas. These little maisim, these maisim, are interesting, but they are not the true measure of a person. And not only that, but even in Kabbalah, there's an idea that sometimes the kayach of maifsim might come from the sitra achra, meaning there are powers of impurity that can give a person an ability to do things. So the fact that somebody can do things, it might be amazing, but it doesn't necessarily show even that they're such a tzaddik, because there's kaychas of tuma that get involved. So the Brisker Rav said the only thing that should impress us about somebody is their Torah and their Yiras Shamayim and their midos, and that's what we should look at. In fact, they tell a story. The Brisker Rav, of course, was not a chassid; he was a misnaged. But there was a certain Hasidic Rebbe that he very much liked. He was Makarev, this Rebbe. So his Talmidim said, "What's so special about this Rebbe?" So he said, "I'll tell you what's so special about this Rebbe. People come to a Rebbe and they ask for a segula for parnasa, a segula for children, and every Rebbe tells them to do something. He says, somebody goes to this Rebbe and they say, I want a segula for a shidduch. So the Rebbe says, learn Maseches Kedushin Be'iyim. He says, I want a segula for business. You got to go through Bava Mitzvah with the Shita Mekubetzes. So this Rebbe doesn't have a lot of Hasidim. Listen, I don't want to go to a Rebbe who tells me I got to learn Bava Mitzvah with the Shita Mekubetzes. He says, but that's my type of Hasidic Rebbe. Not a Rebbe who's with miracles and skulas, but a Rebbe that says, you want to be close to Hashem, you want to get the brachas of Hashem, be omel b'Torah, be omel in tefilla. Right? So it's less dramatic, it's less exciting. So on one hand, we do believe that a tzaddik has a kayach to do things. On the other hand, it's not that important in our worldview, and it's not always indicative of tzidkus, so we wouldn't really focus on that. In fact, there was a sefer shortly after the Gra was nifter there's a sefer Aliyas Elio. Aliyas Elio is a compendium of all sorts of miracle stories that the Gra did. And I think Rav Chaim Voloshener wrote, he gave a haskama to it, but he said, these stories are important only because they can show you where Torah can lead you to. But the thing we should learn from it is that we should learn not that the Gra was great because he did miracles. The Gra was great because of his Torah learning. So we do have that ambiguity about that. Yeah.
What's the view on as Sheva Roim learning Tanach? Because I've heard a bit of a controversy.
Yeah, this is crazy. This is really guilt by association. First of all, there is a Gemara, and the Rambam brings it Halacha, that a person is supposed to divide his day into 3 equal portions. A third, the written Torah, which is Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim. A third, Mishnah, which we would call Halacha, really. And the third is Gemara, which we would call in-depth understanding, like our Gemara. And the Rambam brings this lahalacha that you should divide your day in 3. But then he says that once you know Tanach and you know halacha, then you should spend most of your time on Gemara. But most of us never reach that level. So for most of us, the assumption would be we should divide our days in 3. Now, obviously, we don't do that, right? We may not do almost anything for the first 2. So already Rabbeinu Tam brings, you already see, all the time of the Rishonim, that even though we spend all of our time learning Gemara, but he says, in Gemara, you're Yaitse all 3. Because Gemara has Psukim, so you've covered your Tanach, and the Gemara has Mishnayos, so you've covered your definitive halacha. And he even says, B'derech Drush, obviously this is not the pshat, that the reason Talmud Bavli is called Bavli, obviously the real answer is it was written in Babylonia. But he says, because Balul, it's a mixture of Torah, Shebichsav, Mishnah, and halacha. Now you see already in Rabbeinu Tam's time, which was the 1100s, already people were not learning Tanach to the same degree, and Rabbeinu Tam tried to give a limud zechus, a defense for that practice. At the same time, look at the Rishonim who wrote on the Torah. Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, many, many more. Obviously, they thought it was worthwhile to focus on not only Torah, but also Nevi'im and Kesuvim. And then we have the Achronim, which is a Malbim, the Netziv, the Meshech Chachma. So the truth of the matter is, it is important that a person learns Tanach, but the Gra, by the way, the Gra says that as well. A person should learn Tanach every day, 1 perek of Nevi'im, besides Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum, which is a Chiyuv, 1 perek of Nevi'im and Kesuvim every day, and that way you finish it relatively quick. And that 1 perek would be a little bit more than a year, be like a year and a half or so, but you get to finish it. Rav Chaim Kanievsky makes that part of his Seder with everything else. Bavli, Yerushalmi, Shulchan Aruch, Rambam. In addition, he learns a perek of Nach every day. And it's a real chaval, because especially when you learn Agadata. Agadata is darshaning psukim. And half the time, maybe 2/3 of the time, we don't know what the pasuk is saying. And we don't understand the drasha because we don't know what is the... When you learn Agadata, you should always look up the pasuk, see what the pasuk is saying, and then try to understand how is the drasha giving me a different aspect of the pasuk. That is, how is it playing against the pasuk? So part of why Nach got neglected in recent centuries is a product of the Haskalah. There was, at the end of the 1700s, the 18th century, the 19th century, and into the 20th century, this is called the Age of Enlightenment. And the Hebrew word is Haskalah. And although Haskalah sounds like a positive thing, beautiful enlightenment, we consider Haskalah to be a bit of a negative movement. And this is, Jews were able to go to universities, and Jews were involved in secular studies. And as a result, many people, there were religious maskilim, but many of the maskilim thought that rabbinic Judaism was oppressive, it was old-fashioned. So they rejected Gemara, they rejected rabbinic studies, and they wanted to focus on the beauties of Tanach. They would focus on the language and the grammar. So it's a guilt by association that if you were in a yeshiva based medrash and you pulled out, you were learning nach, people would assume you were a maskil. You were not a true believer, as it were. You see, guilt by association. So it's a chaval. I think that the Ger Rebbe once said that certain things have been stolen from us. The Zionists stole Zionism, and the Baal Teshuva stole Teshuva. Because in reality, think about this, the love of Eretz Yisrael we should all have. Elamai, but since these non-religious Zionists emphasize it, we gotta move away. Tshuva. Every Jew should do tshuva. But nah, tshuva is a Baal Teshuva thing. You know, I'm not a Baal Teshuva, so you know, it's like the Baal Teshuva stole tshuva, and the Zionists stole not Zionism, but stole love of Eretz Yisrael. And I would add, the Maskilim stole nach. And that's too bad, because there's a tremendous amount of beautiful lessons. By the way, I don't want to give a self-advertisement, but I might as well tell you if anyone is interested. There's a wonderful website, Kol HaLashon, which has thousands and thousands and thousands of shiurim from hundreds of teachers. I mean, there's wonderful things, all of it for free. So I've been doing a parak of Nach. I've been giving shiurim on Nach, and Baruch Hashem, it's progressed. So far we've done Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Shmuel Al, Shmuel Beis, Malachim Al, Malachim Beis. And now I'm in a very big challenge. Now we're doing Yeshayahu, which is a very, very rough one. So you can actually go on the website and you get you can see, I mean, you don't have to do this, of course, but you could see a shiur. And again, there are other people who give shiurim too. So you could see a lot of good shiurim on Nach, on the Kol HaLashon. That's Kol HaLashon. Okay? So Nach is a good thing to learn. But again, the fear is that you should limit it, because in fact there is one Maimer Chazal. Rabbi Eliezer told his children, or said to his Talmidim rather, Minu b'neichem min hahigoyon. Hold back your children from reflection. Now it's not clear. What is higayon? It's an ambiguous term. Rashi says higayon is spending too much time on learning Nach without the Torah Shebaal Peh. So there was a fear that if you separate the Torah Shebichsav from the Torah Shebaal Peh, that could lead you into a bad direction. Yeah?
What is the halacha in regards to talking about divrei chol on Shabbat?
Yeah, so what is the halacha about talking divrei chol on Shabbat? The short answer is that it's generally considered to be asur, but like anything else, there are many, many complications. What do we mean by divrei chol? If we're talking about business affairs, business transactions, that would clearly be asur. If you're simply talking about things that happened during the week, just stories, things that happened during the week. So technically, it's not the highest thing to talk about on Shabbos, because Shabbos should be Torah, tefilla, zemiros, but it's not asur. It's not asur to say, hey, I met my old chavrusa last Tuesday. That's divrei chol, but that's going to be mutter. So really, the issue of divrei chol are in yonim of mekach umemkar, in yonim of business, and in yonim involving hachana, preparation for weekday activities. So for example, if Motzei Shabbos, you are planning to go to the States, you're going to take a trip or whatever it is, you shouldn't be talking about, you can talk about what you're going to do in the trip. You can say, when I get to New York, I'm going to give a share, or I'm going to visit. That you're allowed to talk about, but you shouldn't talk about the details in preparing the trip. I gotta leave the airport by a certain time, etc., because that's in yanim of hachana, and you shouldn't be meichen on Shabbos for what you're going to do during the week. Okay? Yeah.
Making the assumptions there, I don't have the source on hand, but there are numerous points in the Gemara where certain different, various others are discussed, and the language that's used about them is very dramatic. This is the consequences of this are very bad, and this is the worst thing you can do. And I believe that this is said about numerous different other areas. So, how do you, first of all, a very priority, sometimes some mitzvahs over others, and you have to say, I'm going to do one over instead of, there are sometimes you have to balance these things and you have to have a system. So, first of all, how do you balance those things out? And second of all, why is that irresponsible of the Gemara? Why is that using such language and which would create such difficulty to not consider?
Yeah, this is a very good question. For example, in Mamare Chazal, it'll often say, this mitzvah is equal to all the mitzvahs of the Torah. But it says it by a lot of mitzvahs, right? It says it by bris, it says it by Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, right? So how can something be equal to all the mitzvahs of the Torah if there's another mitzvah that's equal to all the mitzvahs of the Torah? Because when I say A is equal to B to Z, but then I say Z is equal to A to Y, I'm kind of contradicting myself, because how can something, it's like, how can two different mitzvahs be the most important mitzvah in the Torah? And by Averis, we have the same thing. He who transgresses this mitzvah, Avodah Zarah is one example, Shabbos is another example, it's as if you violated the whole Torah. Or there are other mamarim that say if you're motzi zera levatala, it's ki'ilu, you transgress the whole Torah, and there's no tshuva. So this is a delicate issue, because on one hand, we of course have to believe every word of Chazal is emes, every word of Chazal is true. On the other hand, there are meforshim, and again, I could try to collect an actual makairis, because I think this would need some sources, that say that sometimes the Chachamim spoke in a certain guzma in order to impress on people how chamor something is. In other words, Chachamim sometimes did not use their lashon to be meant exactly literal, but to simply tell you, this is very important, do not ignore it. But I'll try to get you a marker, because that chiddush is a little bit of a controversial chiddush. But clearly there are meforshim that specifically say that you don't have to accept, for example, Zera Levatala is an example. When it says Shecher Zera Levatala is the most chomer averish b'Torah, and there is no tshuva, even the Baal Tanya writes that avada there's tshuva. Tshuva might be difficult, etc., but there certainly is tshuva, and Chazal didn't mean there is no tshuva, right? So we do see that approach in a number of places. Yeah.
Where is the how are mekubalim allowed? What is their sefaros in justifying the speaking to Mason when there is an isser for necromancy?
Yeah, there is, of course, an issue in the Torah to inquire of the dead, to bring up the dead, to communicate to the dead. And yet we sometimes find things that seem like some Mekubalim or mystics are doing that communication. How could that be mutter? The truth is, we don't understand the process enough, meaning there are ways in which you're utilizing your connection to Hashem to do something, and there are ways that you're utilizing spirits of impurity to do something. Now, we would not know the difference. We wouldn't know if it's staring us in the face, which is which. But the same way, like in the secular world, they talk about black magic, white magic, whatever that means, there is a notion of being mishtamesh with kochos of kedusha versus being mishtamesh with kochos of tuma. We do not know the difference, so we automatically get pulled into the wrong direction here. But a person on a certain madrega of kedusha is able to be mishtamesh with kochos of kedusha in that way. But it is something that should be avoided, because most of us are not able to gauge our madrega. In fact, there was a whole literature which has never been printed, but Mekubalim have it in Ksav Yad, manuscripts. This is called Kabbalah Ma'asis. Kabbalah Ma'asis means practical Kabbalah. Now, practical Kabbalah, the closest word I can use, although that's not the right word, is magic. Like, how do you do levitation? How do you do this and that? Make things disappear? And apparently, in Kabbalah, there is such inyanim. But it was never printed because it was not proper to publicize among people, because people just want to do the magic stuff without the Kedusha stuff. And therefore, there are Mekubalim that have this literature, but it's under lock and key. In fact, somebody actually told me that, literally, like there's a locked closet that has all of this stuff. So I guess we just don't really understand this process at all. Yeah.
This was sent in. What is the earliest makor for Purim Torah, and can the Rav share a few of his most favorite and best ones he's heard and or created?
Okay, so B'li Neder, I'll make a promise. B'li Neder, I will try to bring in some good Purim Torah before Purim. I happen not to have it off the top of my head, but the minhag of Purim Torah is an old minhag, and you can go back to probably around the time of Rashi, if not earlier, but we can document it all the way back. Not that Rashi himself did it, but that time. We have, for example, amazing things. We have a Maseches Purim. Not Maseches Megillah is in Shas, but somebody wrote a Maseches Purim, which is a parody. It's written just like a Gemara, but it's full of jokes and leitzanos and Purim humor, and in the style of a Shakla Vitaria. You could probably get something online like that. So, and that goes way back. That's a very old minhag, and it's from the time of the Rishonim. In the Yeshivas in Europe, they would have a Purim Rosh Yeshiva. They would make a bacher to kind of be Rosh Yeshiva for the day, and he would often make fun a little bit of the Rosh Yeshivas, and the like. Volozhin was a big deal. In Volozhin, the Purim Rav was a very chashuv honor, because they only made a bacher the Purim Rosh Yeshiva if he was kind of, capable of being on that madrega. I think at some point the Netziv was mavatal it because it got a little too biting at some point. They thought it wasn't covered at Torah. But these are very, very old minhagim. I'll try to get you documentation next week. Yeah. I'm sorry, you have another one? Yeah. Oh.
I also said that as well. If Malacha is usually defined as the creative actions, why is Shabbos known as a day of rest or menucha? But to be known as a day of work.
Yeah. So the question is, we discussed, I mentioned Rav Hirsch's idea that the definition of malacha is not physical exertion, but it's the mastery and dominion over the raw materials of nature. And that's why, even if a malacha is not physically exhausting, like turning on a light, it's going to be usher. Mashiach in the house, I can schlep a table around, even though it's tiring, because I'm not doing any type of chiddush to it. So the question is, if malacha is not about exertion, malacha is about creativity and dominion, then in what sense do we say that Shabbos is a day of menucha? So that's a very, very excellent question. I think my answer would be based on a very interesting yesod of the Ramban. The Ramban writes, and it's interesting, he writes it in his drasha to Rosh Hashanah. It's really an insight about Shabbos. But derech agav, it's mentioned in his famous drasha of Rosh Hashanah that there are two things. Malacha has a precise definition, and that would follow Rav Hirsch, although the Ramban doesn't bring Rav Hirsch. But menucha is a superimposed category on malacha, that in addition to not doing malacha, Shabbos should be a day of rest, in the sense that you can make your heart panoi to avodas Hashem. And therefore the Ramban says the following chiddush. Let me point this out. The Ramban points out the Chachamim assered many things that the Torah permits. For example, muktzah. Muktzah is drabanan. D'oraisa, if I want to handle money, and there's an erev, right? In other words, let's say I want to keep my store open on Shabbos. Let's look at it d'oraisa. If I keep my store open on Shabbos, I buy and I sell and I take money, I don't write anything down, I don't turn on the lights are on a Shabbos clock. Do you realize, think about it for a moment, d'oraisa, I could have my store open on Shabbos. What malacha am I doing? Okay, if I'm a lawyer, lawyers have to write. Okay, I'm a storekeeper. But the Ramban says, if a person is going to buy and sell and handle money, Shabbos will not be a day of rest. Therefore, the Chachamim prohibited mekach umemkar. They prohibited muksa, you don't handle money. So the Ramban writes that these rabbinic enactments are not stam rabbanans. They are definitions in how you fulfill the doraisa of menucha. And therefore, if I have my store open on Shabbos, says the Ramban, I'm not only over the din rabbanan of mekach umemkar, I am over the chiyuv that Shabbos has to be a day of menucha. This is an example of the Rabbanan are defining how you fulfill the Torah's imperative. So I think based on that yesod, the answer would be that Shabbos would have these two components. There is a definition of malacha, and then there's a chiyuv of menucha. The only nafkamina is, menucha is not a negative, and menucha is a positive. So you wouldn't get the death penalty for violating menucha, and you wouldn't bring a sin offering. You wouldn't bring a korban chatas, right? So there are two different categories. Not doing malacha and resting are two separate chiyuvim on Shabbos. Yeah.
I remember hearing that during the Sheva process, one should feel simcha because he's returning to God. And then I've also heard that you're supposed to feel regret and sadness over the sin. So which one are you supposed to go by? And in reference to the last one, at what point in the Teshuvah process does regret over sin becomes like self-loathing and it's the horror now?
Yeah. So let me take the second question first. One of the steps of tshuva is charata. Charata means regret. Regret means I have remorse, I have sadness. I feel bad that I did something not proper, or I didn't do something I should have done. And that's part of tshuva. Without charata, you're not really changing. And that's 100% true. Charata is an essential element of tshuva. I gotta feel bad. The question becomes that charata can turn into self-loathing, it can turn into depression, it can turn into sadness, and then it actually becomes a sin. Because when I get depressed and I'm filled with self-loathing, I will no longer be motivated to change myself for the better because I feel I am too broken. I feel I'm too worthless. I feel there's no hope. So basically, your question identified exactly the parameters of the problem. This is why Rabbeinu Yaina says that when a person does tshuva, he should first work on fixing the future and shouldn't think about the past that much. And when you get stronger, then go back and be mischaret. But you're mischaret from a point of strength and not from a point of weakness. You're mischaret after you've made positive changes. And he says, when you make the positive changes, you should not think about how bad I was. Because if you think about how bad I was, you're not going to be able to change. Rather, your attitude has to be, as the t-shirt saying goes, today is the first day of the rest of my life. Forget about the past. Later, you can think about the past and where you went wrong. So he suggests that charata is not the precursor to change. It is a step you engage in after you've already started making those positive changes. So that's a very, very important point. You can see this in the Yesod HaTshuva. Yesod HaTshuva is a short essay, which Rabbeinu Yaina himself wrote, which is a summary of Sharei Tshuva. I think the Art Scroll Machzer actually prints the Yesod HaTshuva, and you'll see this there. Now, your first question was about Shiva, that morning. Oh, I'm sorry, during Tshuva. I thought you said Shiva. Okay, I wasn't, yeah. No. So the Baal Tanya, right. Again, the Baal Tanya, it's Chassidus, but again, I think all Sfarim would agree to it. He basically says that Tshuva should essentially be joyous. It's joy. Hashem wants you to come back to Him. And it's such a joy that Hashem forgives me, but you have to make time in your process for charata. But the Baal Tanya, now, he seems to assume you could change your emotions really quickly. It's always hard for me to understand. He says, you should have a half an hour a day where you're sad and you're tzabrachin over your averos, and the rest of the time you're besimcha. And again, this is really common sense, because once again, what's going to motivate you to change? It'll only be simcha that's going to motivate you to change, because if you're so convinced you're a failure, then your energy is zapped, you're sapped, you have no kayach at all. So the simcha has to be the dominant idea of tshuva. And this is important because I think a lot of us, and again, we'll be honest, a lot of us find Yomim Nairoim to be a depressing time a little bit. You're talking about how bad you are and this avera and that avera and that avera. And either we get depressed or we don't like to think about it. We just ignore it because if we think about it, we get depressed. Either way, we push it out of our minds. But if one looked at this as, wow, the gift of a second chance, the gift of an opportunity to fix things, to be better, what could be sweeter than that? And that's why, and again, I'll bring you a raya from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, the happiest day of the Jewish calendar was Yom Kippur, and the 15th of Av, but Yom Kippur, because it's the day of forgiveness, the day of atonement. So Simcha, I think, should be the dominant emotion, because that's going to motivate you. Yeah?
Just the story in the Gemara about the person who was with all the very many women in the world.
Elazar ben Dordia, yeah, right?
So I was wondering, is that considered Halacha, and if so, is that being important for Sheva?
I'm sorry, say it again. Is that what?
Is that considered Halacha, and if so, is that being important for Sheva?
Yeah, so the question is the famous story about the man, Elazar ben Dordia, who had been with every prostitute in the world, and finally he came to real tshuva. Maybe we'll go over the whole story a little another time. And he died from his suffering in the sins that he had committed, and a voice from heaven called him, Rabbi, Elazar ben Dordia now has a share in the world to come. And the Chachamim used to cry over this story, and they said, wow, Yesh kaina eilamai b'shah achas. A person can get olam haba with 1 minute. His whole life was averos. 1 minute of sincere tshuva. Everything changes. And yet, chaval, we don't have that minute. All we need is a minute. And we often don't have that minute. So he wants to say that since his sin was being with prostitutes, perhaps that was called zera levatala, and since his tshuva was accepted, could that be a source to the Baal Tanya's statement that even zera levatala, there is tshuva, right? That's your question. It's a very, very interesting point. It's a little complicated, because I'll tell you the truth. It's not clear that being with a prostitute would be called zera levatala, because l'maisa, the zera went into a woman's body, even if it was sinful. I mean, let me give you an example. Let's take a sinful relationship. If a man is mizana with an eshes ish, a very big avera, but is it called zera levatala? I think not. It's another avera, right? So the fact that there was derech tashmish, I think, would negate zera. So that's an interesting question. So by a non-Jew, some do want to say that if a Jew has relations with a non-Jewish woman, that is called zera levatala. That is no better, and maybe worse, than pure masturbation. So if that would be the case, and if we assume that his zonos were non-Jewish women, perhaps you have a little bit of a raya. Yeah, I hear you. Shkayach. Okay, one more,
There's in the Gemara in Sukkah, when it's talking about the Sheva Roim, the 7 shepherds that are coming at Lasilavu, and it says Yitzchak Avinu was not included in those Sheva Roim. Rashi brings a medrash saying that Yitzchak went down to Gehenna to save his son. What does that mean, or what is going on there?
Well, it's hard to know what's going on there, but there is, Rashi is actually citing a Gemara in Masechah Shabbos. It's not just a medrash, Masechah Shabbos, that Yitzchak Avinu stands by the gateway of Gehenna. And any Jew that's going to go in, Yitzchak Avinu saves him in the merit of bris milah, because Yitzchak was the first, well, Avram did milah to himself, but Yitzchak was the first Jewish child that was given a bris by his father, and therefore Yitzchak is matzel all Yidden from Gehenna in the merit of bris milah. So that's why he's not there with the 7 Roim. He's on assignment somewhere else. Now, what that means even practically is hard for us to understand. I mean, does the Gemara in Shabbos mean if you have a bris, you don't go to Gehenna? That's a pretty good deal. I mean, that means a person can do all these averos, doesn't go to Gehenna because they have a bris. That's what the Gemara says. But I think we have to understand it, that when it says he saves us from Gehenna, meaning he saves us from the Gehenna that we deserve, meaning there has to be some onesh, there has to be some purification, but in the merit of milah, it's a much lighter punishment than it otherwise would be. So it doesn't mean you don't go to Gehenna at all, but he's mekel the din of Gehenna. Okay, take everybody, be well.